Good evening, everybody. How are you doing today? Right, I want to first double check if you can hear me clearly and if you can see the blackboard and the PowerPoint here. All right, great. I'm doing well, thank you. All right, so the last things that we've been discussing was the anatomical structure of the female reproductive system. We also discussed in our last session the gametogenesis, and we discussed as an example of the gametogenesis the spermatogenesis. If you remember, spermatogenesis, this is a process by which we're going to be producing sperms in the seminiferous tubules. And the spermatogenesis, if you remember, started by the stem cell. It's called the spermatogonium. So we start with agonia, spermatogonia. And remember, the spermatogonia will be performing a mitotic division. So I started by a cell that has a complete set of the genetic material. I have the 46 chromosomes. And I will be performing my first cell division, which is a mitotic division. I will be performing a mitosis. And remember, what results from the mitotic division? Two daughter cells that gonna be identical to the mother cell, similar to one another and identical to the mother cell. They contain the same exact genetic material like the mother cell. We call those are the primary spermatocytes. If you remember, mitosis here is the reason why males don't develop menopause, because some of those primary sites will become gonia and will keep dividing, producing an unlimited number of sperms. So I don't have a limited number of sperms that I can produce through a specific period of time, and then I will run out of sperms at a certain point. So that's why males here do not develop menopause, due to the presence of the mitotic division throughout their life. Some of the primary spermatocytes that won't be used to form spermatogonia again will be performing another type of cell divisions. This is called the meiosis. And if you remember, meiosis, it's two successive cell divisions. So the primary site, primary spermatocyte, did have a complete number of chromosomes. I still have 46 chromosomes like the spermatogonia, but those primary spermatocytes going to be passing through two cell divisions. Those are meiosis 1 and then meiosis 2. So from meiosis 1, what would I be producing? I would be forming a secondary spermatocyte. And remember, the secondary spermatocyte contains only half of the genetic material. But remember, it contains half of the genetic material, but 2 copies of this have the number of chromosomes. And that's why meiosis requires another cell division, which is meiosis 2. Meiosis 2, as I complete meiosis 2 by the secondary spermatocyte, remember, this is going to be forming the mature cell on here, the spermatid. But remember, the spermatids are spherical and they won't be able to travel through the sperm carrying ducts in the male reproductive system and through the female reproductive system to reach the egg for fertilization. So what will I need to do? I will be passing through our last step, which is the modification of the shape of the spermatid into a sperm. If you remember, the sperms do have tail, a mid portion, a head, which is pointed, and towards the tip of the head of the sperm, I have the acrosomes that contains the digestive enzymes that allow the sperm to penetrate through the ovulated egg. And we call this transformation in the shape of the spermatid into a sperm. This is sperm myogenesis. And if you remember, I told you last session, you need to be able to differentiate between spermatogenesis, which is a whole process, mitosis, meiosis 1, meiosis 2, and spermiogenesis. From the spermiogenesis, which is the very last step of the spermatogenesis, which is a transformation of the spermatid into a sperm. So the meiosis results in the formation of 4 spermatids that will differentiate by spermiogenesis into 4 sperms. So again, we started with a stem cell located in the testis. We call those are my spermatogonia. Spermatogonium gonna be passing through a mitotic division, forming 2 primary spermatocytes. Some primary spermatocytes gonna be taking the place of the mother cell, becoming spermatogonia, and some others will start the meiosis, which is formed of 2 steps, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, and this results in the formation of 4 cells that contain only half of the genetic material. Each of them, we call those cells are my spermatids. Remember, spermatids cannot travel through the sperm carrying ducts, cannot travel through the vagina, the cervix, the endometrium to reach the egg in the fallopian tube. So I need to modify the shape. I need to trim the cells to form the final shape of the sperms that has the tail, mid portion containing lots of mitochondria, head, which is pointed, containing digestive enzymes, and so on. So we call this as the spermiogenesis, a process by which you're going to be trimming the spermatid into the final shape of the sperm. This is how we were able to form a sperm from a stem cell that we call the spermatogonium. Today we're looking at something different on here. We're looking at the oogenesis. What is oogenesis? Genesis is the creation, and oo means egg. Oogenesis is the formation of the egg in the ovary. It's very similar to the spermatogenesis. That's why we started by reviewing the spermatogenesis. So the ovary gonna contain stem cells. We call them the oogonia. So I start with an oogonium. Remember, the gonia contain a complete set of chromosomes. It's a diploid cell. The oogonium gonna pass through a mitotic division. I'm passing through mitosis. And remember, when I pass through a mitotic division, this is going to result in the formation of two cells that will resemble the mother cell. So the two cells that I'm producing are still going to contain the complete set of chromosomes. We call those cells are my primary oocytes. So primary site going to be formed by completing the mitotic division. Primary oocyte going to be passing through a two-step cell division, two successive cell divisions. This is going to be meiosis 1. Can you guess what's going to be the name of the eggs that you're going to be forming when you complete meiosis 1? Can you guess the name on here? When you complete mitosis, the oogonium becomes a primary oocyte. So when you complete meiosis 1, what's the primary oocyte will become? Remember, primary site in spermatogenesis becomes a secondary site. So here, when I complete meiosis 1, the primary oocyte becomes a secondary oocyte. Remember, secondary sites gonna contain only half of the genetic material. But remember, it's not a mature egg yet. It's not mature yet. It didn't complete the second division of the meiosis. Why it's not a mature cell? Because remember, yes, you have half of the genetic material, but you have two copies of this half of the genetic material. So I need to reduce the number of chromosomes inside the cell. So what will I do? I will be completing the other cell division of the meiosis, which is meiosis 2. So once the secondary oocyte divides by meiosis 2, this is going to result in the formation of the mature egg, which we call the ovum. All right, so almost the same like spermatogenesis. Almost the same like spermatogenesis. I started by an oogonium. The oogonium divides by mitosis. It becomes a primary oocyte. Primary oocyte divides by meiosis 1. It becomes a secondary oocyte. And in order for me to reduce the number of chromosomes, I would be forming a small cell here. This is my first polar body. Secondary oocyte gonna be dividing by meiosis 2. This is gonna form the mature egg or the ovum. And in order also to be able to reduce the number of chromosomes, what will I do? I will form a second polar body. So those are non-functions. They don't play any role here in terms of reproduction normally. The main purpose of the formation of those polar bodies, the first polar body and the second polar body, is just to reduce the number of chromosomes for me to be able to get the mature. But how come did you say early today and last class that because of this mitotic division in males, males do not develop menopause. So I see here you do have mitotic division in the ovary. So how come both of them have mitosis of the gonia, but only females will develop menopause? There is a key difference on here between spermatogenesis and oogenesis. Spermatogenesis starts at the time of puberty. All the different steps will be taking place for life after puberty, all the time. Spermatogonia going to be dividing into primary sites, spermatocyte, to secondary sites, into spermatids that will differentiate into sperms. But here in females, the mitotic division is taking place only during fetal life. So a female will be born with a limited number, I have a specific number of primary oocytes in the ovary. I don't have continuous mitotic division like I do have in males. In females, the mitosis is only going to be taking place during fetal life. It will stop after birth. All right, that's why females will have a limited number of primary sites compared to males will have an unlimited number of primary sites. That's why females, when they deplete this specific number of primary oocytes they have in their ovary, they will develop menopause. Why males won't develop menopause? Because this step is going to be taking place all the time after puberty. So when would I have a mature egg, an ovum? Primary oocytes are going to be kept in the ovary until puberty. The eggs are not free in the ovary. They are surrounded by other cells. We call those are the follicular cells. So the egg is kept inside a cluster of cells. We call this is the follicle. Each month after puberty, one of the follicles kept in the ovary will become the dominant follicle. This dominant follicle still gonna have a primary oocyte inside. Until when? Until the time of ovulation. By the time of ovulation, the primary oocyte will be allowed to complete meiosis 1. So now by the time of ovulation, this ovulated egg becomes a secondary oocyte. So this is by the time of ovulation. And this takes place for one mature follicle. Only the primary oocyte in the mature follicle will be capable to complete meiosis 1 and so develop a secondary oocyte. Did I have a mature egg or not yet by the time of ovulation? Do I have a mature egg? Is the egg that got released from the ovary, is it a mature egg? What do you think? Is this a mature egg, the secondary oocyte? Is the secondary oocyte on here, is it a mature egg? It's not yet a mature egg. So when will it become? When will it become an ovum? It becomes an ovum only if it gets penetrated by a sperm. So the secondary oocyte will not be able to complete meiosis 2 for it to form a mature egg, an ovum, unless it gets penetrated by a sperm. So again, looking here at the differences between spermatogenesis and oogenesis. Spermatogenesis, you have mitosis, meiosis 1, meiosis 2, sperm myogenesis are taking place all the time after puberty. For the oogenesis, you start with an oogonium that will divide by mitosis, but this mitotic division is only going to be taking place during fetal life. So it stops after birth. So after birth, I have a limited number of primary oocytes kept inside the follicle. Each month after puberty, what happens? One of those follicles kept in the ovary will become a mature or a dominant follicle. This mature dominant follicle is the one that ruptures and will allow ovulation to take place. By the time of ovulation, the primary oocyte will be allowed to complete meiosis 1, forming a secondary oocyte. Remember, secondary oocytes are not mature eggs. They are not mature eggs. When would I have a mature egg? If the secondary oocyte gets penetrated by a sperm, at this point only, the secondary oocyte gonna be dividing, completing meiosis 2, and will form the mature egg or the ovum. Is this clear? Clear? All right. So what's gonna be regulating the oogenesis and how the eggs are going to become mature in the ovary and how ovulation takes place. All right, so this is going to be oogenesis is part of the essay question, and all what we're going to be discussing in the first part of the class today is going to be part of your essay question. So please pay attention on here with me. So by the time of puberty, remember, the hypothalamus starts to release a hormone called GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. The gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release FSH and LH, but we're focusing here on FSH for now. Mainly FSH. Who's waiting to become stimulated by FSH? What FSH stands for? What FSH stands for? Follicle stimulating hormone. Inside the ovary, I've got the follicles that will get stimulated by FSH. And this is why actually we called FSH FSH. Its function is to stimulate the follicles. So inside the ovary, here we're looking at the ovary. Inside the ovary, I've got what type of eggs? Can you remind me, what is the type of eggs that you've got in the ovary from the time of birth until ovulation. What is the type of eggs that I have in the ovary? Looking on here. What is the type of eggs that we have in the ovary during childhood, infancy, childhood, until puberty, after puberty, until I've got an ovulation? From fetal life to ovulation, what is the type of eggs that you've got in the ovary? What is the type of egg that you've got in the ovary again? Primary oocyte. Primary oocytes. This is the eggs. This is the type of eggs that we have inside the ovary from the day, from the time of birth until ovulation. But remember, those oocytes are going to be kept surrounded by cells. And we call those are my follicular cells. Together, the follicular cells and the egg is what we call the follicle. So primary oocyte is kept in the ovary, surrounded by one row of flat cells, like what you see on here. An egg plus follicular cells, it's called the follicle. We call those follicles kept in the ovary, those are the primordial follicles. So each month after puberty, what's going to happen? The hypothalamus releases GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, that stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release FSH. And remember, FSH is a pituitary hormone that will be stimulating the primordial follicles kept in the ovary. Each month, the rise of FSH is going to be stimulating a number of primordial follicles for them to mature into first this is the egg on here, and instead of being surrounded by one row of flat cells, now the follicular cells will become cuboidal. We call this egg surrounded by cuboidal cells. This is my primary follicle. Can you remind me what kind of egg do I have inside this follicle? What do you think? What is the type of eggs that we've got in here in the primary follicle? Remember, the type of egg that you have in the ovary from fetal life until ovulation, it's called the primary oocyte. So here, did I have any ovulation? Not yet. No ovulation yet. So what kind of egg do I have in the primary follicle? It's a primary oocyte. So I've got some primordial follicles that will become activated, will become primary follicles. The primary follicles will become secondary follicles, which is the egg now is going to be, rather than surrounded by just one row of cuboidal cells, is going to be surrounded by multiple layers of cuboidal and columnar cells. We call this follicle is my secondary follicle. What kind of egg do you have in the secondary follicle? What kind of egg do you have in the secondary follicle? Still a primary oocyte. It's still a primary oocyte. I didn't have ovulation yet. The follicle did not rupture to release the egg out. So no ovulation yet means I still have a primary oocyte. One of the growing follicles will become the dominant follicle, and it will be forming I don't know why it's not forming a circle on here. All right, so imagine this is a circle, all right? This is my primary oocyte. And the follicular cell's gonna be forming a space filled by fluid. Will fuse together and will form space filled by fluid like this. We call this follicle, it's the mature follicle or the Graafian follicle. So those are other follicular cells that didn't form this space filled with fluid. So this space filled with fluid on here is called the antrum. Again, what do we call this mature follicle? It's called my Graafian follicle. So again, what did enhance the primordial follicles kept in the ovary to become mature follicles or Graafian follicles is FSH. So at the beginning of each month after puberty, FSH rises. It stimulates a number of primordial follicles in the ovary. They will start to mature to become primary follicles and secondary follicles and Graafian. Only one dominant follicle will become the mature follicle or the Graafian follicle. All right, so what happens after that? So this is the first half of the menstrual cycle and the ovarian cycle. During this first half of the ovarian cycle, those growing follicles, primordial follicles becoming primary follicles, becoming secondary follicles, and one of the dominant follicle will become a mature or a Graafian follicle. All those growing follicles are going to be producing an ovarian hormone called the estrogen. Especially the Graafian follicle or the mature follicle. The Graafian follicle is going to be releasing large amounts of estrogen. And this large amounts of estrogen is what's going to be stimulating the anterior pituitary gland to release another hormone by large amounts. This is called my LH. So in response to the high estrogen output from the Graafian follicle or the mature follicle, the anterior pituitary gland is going to be releasing large amounts of LH. We call this sudden rise in the LH levels. It's the LH surge. LH surge gonna have multiple effects on the Graafian follicle or the mature follicle. First one is going to be stimulating the primary oocyte to complete meiosis 1, become more mature. It's not a mature egg yet, but become more mature, allowing it to complete meiosis 1. It becomes a secondary oocyte. Secondary oocyte. And the Graafian follicle, this mature follicle, in response to this sudden rise in the LH levels, will rupture, and the remaining follicular cells that were surrounding the egg will form together a yellow body that remains in the ovary. We call this is the Corpus Luteum. A third effect here is going to be the release of the egg. So it ruptures, the follicle ruptures, releasing the egg, allowing ovulation to take place. So again, what are the mid-cyclic changes? This what takes place around day 14 of the cycle. On day 14 of the cycle, what happens? I've got a mature follicle. We call the mature follicle the Graafian follicle. Graafian follicle is going to be releasing estrogen like the other growing follicles. But the Graafian follicle is going to be releasing large amounts of estrogen. This high output of estrogen is what's going to be stimulating the anterior pituitary gland to release large amounts of LH. And this takes place suddenly. So we call this is an LH surge. What's going to be the three effects here of the LH surge? First, it enhances the maturation of the primary oocyte into secondary oocyte. It allows the secondary oocyte, the primary oocyte, to complete meiosis 1. Remember, you allow meiosis 1 only by the time of ovulation. And what did trigger both the maturation of primary oocyte into secondary oocyte and the ovulation is actually the LH surge. This is what triggered the primary oocyte to complete meiosis 1. The second factor here is a rupture of the Graafian follicle. This results in the ovulation, the release of the egg. And the third effect is the transformation of the follicular cells that were forming the Graafian follicle to be transformed into a corpus luteum. How the corpus luteum is different from the follicle? It's going to be responsible to release a different ovarian hormone. We call this hormone, it's the progesterone. Pro before, and gestation means pregnancy. So this is a hormone that precedes gestation, progesterone. This is again released from the corpus luteum. Progesterone is going to have an inhibitory effect on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. So progesterone is doing what in here to the GnRH? It decreases the GnRH. It decreases as a result the FSH and LH, because this is a negative feedback. So once I've got progesterone inhibits the release of GnRH from the hypothalamus. It inhibits the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary gland. Until when would I keep producing progesterone? Until the corpus luteum gets broken down. When would the corpus luteum be broken down? It's according. If there was no fertilization of this egg, so this egg haven't got penetrated by sperm, no sperm this month. If no fertilization of the egg is taking place, the corpus luteum will remain releasing estrogen in the ovary for 14 days. So from day 15 to day 28. And what happens after that? It gets broken down. It degenerates after 14 days. So what's going to happen to the progesterone levels when I degenerate the corpus luteum? What do you think is going to happen to the progesterone levels? Do I have something to produce progesterone now? If I break down the corpus luteum? No, I don't have anything that will be producing progesterone if the corpus luteum gets broken down. So there will be an inhibition in the release of progesterone. So I will have a decline in the levels of progesterone. And as I have a drop in the progesterone levels, who will become reactivated that was inhibited by the progesterone? Progesterone, as we've just mentioned, it inhibits hypothalamus from releasing GnRH. And GnRH is going to be responsible to enhance the anterior pituitary gland to release FSH. So if I don't have progesterone, because I don't have corpus luteum, what's going to happen? Hypothalamus will restart to produce GnRH another time. And GnRH will do what? Will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release FSH. And FSH starts to stimulate few of the primordial follicles in the ovary that will become primary follicles, that will become secondary follicles, that will become one of them, the dominant follicle, will become the Graafian follicle. Remember, those growing follicles are releasing what ovarian hormone? They are producing estrogen. The Graafian follicle or the mature follicle is going to be releasing large amounts of estrogen, which will have a positive feedback on my hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland. This is going to be stimulating the anterior pituitary gland to release large amounts of LH, luteinizing hormone. What do we call this sudden rise in the LH levels? It's my LH surge. LH surge is going to be stimulating the mature follicle or the Graafian follicle, as well as the primary oocyte kept inside. It enhances the primary oocyte to complete meiosis 1. So once the primary oocyte completes meiosis 1, it becomes a secondary oocyte. It enhances the Graafian follicle to rupture. And when it ruptures, it will be releasing the egg out, allowing ovulation to take place. What happens to the remaining follicular cells of the Graafian follicle? They will be forming a yellow body called the corpus luteum. And again, corpus luteum is going to be producing what ovarian hormone? It's my progesterone. Remember, if no fertilization of the egg did take place, corpus luteum going to be broken down within 14 days. Remember, progesterone normally inhibits GnRH, FSH. And if I don't have FSH, I won't have estrogen. So when I'm releasing progesterone, I am actually inhibiting estrogen release. I'm inhibiting new activation and stimulation of primordial follicles. Once the corpus luteum gets broken down, the progesterone levels will decline. This decline in the progesterone levels gonna cause the activation of the hypothalamus to restart its release of the GnRH, stimulating the anterior pituitary gland to release FSH. FSH will stimulate other primordial follicles to become primary, to become secondary, and the dominant follicle will become the Graafian follicle. Remember, I'm releasing what hormone again? From those growing follicles, I'm releasing estrogen. Especially the Graafian follicle. Graafian follicle is going to be releasing huge amounts of estrogen, which will have a positive feedback on my hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland. This will result in a sudden rise in the LH levels. This sudden rise in the LH levels gonna result in 3 main things. Again, completion of meiosis 1, the primary oocyte becomes a secondary oocyte, ovulation, and corpus luteum formation. Remember, what hormone do I produce from the corpus luteum? It's my progesterone. The progesterone has a negative feedback on my hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland, inhibiting the release of GnRH, inhibiting the release of FSH, and so inhibiting the release of estrogen, because as a result of the inhibition of FSH, you're not going to be you're not going to be stimulating new primordial follicles to mature. What if this month there was a fertilization of the egg? The corpus luteum will be kept producing progesterone until its function gets replaced by the placenta of the fetus. We call those steps of the maturation of the follicle, the ovulation, and those cyclic changes, it's the ovarian cycle. This is the cycle of events that will be taking place inside the ovary. Those ovarian cyclic changes are going to be reflected on the uterus. To be more specific, they are going to be reflected on the internal lining of the uterus. If you remember, when we've seen last time the different layers of the uterus, the outermost layer that will be surrounding the uterus from outside, this is my perimetrium. And underneath the perimetrium, we've got the muscle layer. Myometrium. And to the inside of the myometrium, we've got the internal lining of the uterus. We call this is the endometrium. What we're looking at now is just the endometrium. This is what we're concerned with. This is where the cyclic changes gonna be taking place. Endometrium, it's not just a single layer of mucosa. I'm formed of two layers. I have the stratum basal. This is the basal layer of the endometrium. And on top of it, we've got stratum functionalis, or the functional layer. Stratum basalis has a constant thickness and does not get affected by the cyclic changes that are taking place in the ovary. It is responsible to replace the stratum functionalis. This is the layer that will be built up or getting broken down in response to the cyclic changes in the ovary. So if I'm drawing on here, this is the stratum basalis, and this is the stratum functionalis. I start by stratum basalis. This will be the layer that will help the regeneration of the stratum functionalis. Remember, those growing follicles are releasing what ovarian hormone? Can you remind me, what is the ovarian hormone on here that gets released from those growing follicles? Estrogen. So estrogen levels, as the estrogen level is high during the maturation of the follicle, this estrogen is going to be stimulating the stratum basalis to proliferate. I'm increasing the thickness of the endometrial lining. I'm enhancing the formation of glands. I'm building up blood vessels in the endometrial line. And we call this phase of the menstrual cycle or the endometrial cycle It's the proliferative phase. Will keep proliferating, building up glands, adding receptors for the progesterone on those glands, building up blood vessels, and increasing the thickness of the endometrium. Again, what layer of the endometrium is actually proliferating? It's the stratum functionalis. During ovulation, remember, the corpus luteum, it's going to be formed and starts to produce another type of ovarian hormones. It's the progesterone. Progesterone going to also be increasing the thickness of the endometrial lining, increasing the thickness of the stratum functionalis, and it's going to be filling the endometrial glands with secretions. Engorging the blood vessels of the endometrium with blood. And this explains why do we call it progesterone. It is actually responsible to create a suitable environment for the zygote to be implanted. I am filling the endometrium with glands filled with secretions. I am filling the endometrial lining with blood vessels engorged with blood. What happens if there was a fertilization of the ovulated egg? Remember, corpus luteum going to remain for 3 months until its function gets replaced by the placenta. Because I don't want to break down this endometrial lining that I have been preparing for the zygote to be implanted. What if there was no fertilization of the egg? Can you remind me what's going to happen to the corpus luteum? Corpus luteum, if there was no fertilization of the egg, it's going to be broken down within 14 days. So after 14 days, what's going to happen? I've got a drop in the progesterone levels. Is there any other ovarian hormone that can support this endometrial lining? What do you think? Do I have progesterone at this point? After I break down the corpus luteum, do you produce progesterone? No. Do you have estrogen? Still no. Why? Why you don't have estrogen? Because simply the progesterone did actually inhibit the release of FSH. And if you don't have FSH, you're not activating other follicles. And if you're not activating other follicles, you won't have enough estrogen. So there is no ovarian hormones. There will be a sharp decline in all ovarian hormonal levels. Estrogen drops, progesterone drops. There is nothing to support the endometrial lining, the stratum functionalis of the endometrium. So what happens? Stratum functionalis will start to degrade, and it's going to be shedding. We'll get shedding of the endometrium during this phase. What do we call the phase in which you are enhancing the glandular secretions under the effect of the progesterone? We call this phase of the menstrual cycle. It's the secretory phase. And this is going to be between days 15 to 28. By day 28, I have a sharp decline in all ovarian hormonal levels. I don't have estrogen, I don't have progesterone. So what's going to happen to the endometrium? It's going to be shedding. There is no ovarian hormones to support this thick endometrial lining. Shedding of the endometrium is going to be from day 1 to day 4. And then what happens after I have a sharp decline of all ovarian hormones? I lose this negative feedback on my hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus will start to produce GnRH another time that will activate the pituitary gland to release FSH that stimulates another set of primordial follicles from the ovary, and the cycle keeps going. So each month, what happens again? Hypothalamus, each month after puberty, hypothalamus releases GnRH. GnRH stimulates pituitary gland to release FSH that stimulates primordial follicles into primary follicles, into secondary follicles, into a Graafian follicle. The mature follicle, the dominant follicle only is the one that will become the Graafian or the mature follicle. Remember, those stimulated follicles, those growing follicles are releasing what ovarian hormone? They are releasing estrogen. And the estrogen is going to be enhancing the proliferation of the stratum functionalis of the endometrium. Building up glands, building up blood vessels. By day 14, the Graafian follicle releasing lots of estrogen. It will be enhancing the anterior pituitary gland to release large amounts of LH, because this is LH surge. The sudden rise of the LH levels from the pituitary gland going to result in rupture of the Graafian follicle. Ovulation is taking place, corpus luteum going to be formed, and this LH also going to be stimulating the maturation of the primary oocyte into a secondary oocyte. Corpus luteum, what's going to be its function? It's producing an ovarian hormone that prepares the endometrium for the fetus to be implanted. The progesterone. Progesterone inhibits GnRH, inhibits FSH. Until when would I keep the corpus luteum in the ovary? If no fertilization takes place, it gets broken down within 14 days. If there was a fertilization, I need to support this endometrium. I don't want to have shedding of the endometrium if there was a baby. So what will I do in case of fertilization? If there was a fertilization this month, the corpus luteum will not be broken down and it will be kept in the ovary for 3 months until the endometrial lining gets supported by the hormones of the placenta. Remember, estrogen is enhancing the proliferation. So we call the phase of the endometrium on endometrial cycle or the menstrual cycle. It's called the proliferative phase. And the proliferative phase on here, see, it's from around day 5 to day 6 to day 14. This is when the proliferation of the endometrium is going to be taking place. And this is again under the effect of the estrogen released from the growing follicles. I'm enhancing the glands, enlarging the spiral arteries inside the stratum functionalis. After ovulation, corpus luteum formation, we're going to be producing another ovarian hormone. This is my progesterone. And this is going to be responsible for the secretory phase that starts by day 15 to day 28. This enhances further development of the endometrium, enhance the glandular secretions, and engorge the spiral arteries with blood. Another thing that people might notice by the time of ovulation or after ovulation is the mucus plug that gets formed in the cervix. What happens if there was no fertilization? Remember, corpus luteum is going to be degenerated within 14 days, resulting in a major drop in my ovarian hormones. I have a drop in both progesterone and estrogen. As I don't have any ovarian hormone to support the endometrial lining, this is going to result in the shedding of the endometrium, and we call this phase of the uterine cycle. It's the menstrual cycle. The menstrual phase, I'm sorry. Which is going to be between day 1 to day 4 or 5. So menstrual phase and the proliferative phase, it might be different from one female to another. So in some females, it's going to be longer than others and so on. So there is some variation in terms of the length of the menstrual phase and the proliferative phase. So it's going to be slightly variable from one person to the other. But what's constant in all females is going to be the secretory phase. This is going to be constant in everybody. This will last for 14 days, no question. All right, because this is the lifespan of the corpus luteum, which is constant in everybody. So why do we start counting from the menstrual phase? Why day 1 starts by the menses? Although there will be no breakdown of the endometrial lining, shedding of the endometrium, unless you did proliferate first. So definitely the proliferative phase is taking place first, and then secretory phase, and then finally the menstrual phase. Why do I start counting here from the menstrual phase? Any guesses? Because simply this is the very first sign I can observe. Yes, primordial follicles are growing, becoming primary, secondary, Graafian follicle, but I can't see any of this. Endometrium is proliferating, building up the stratum functionalis. I can't see it. What I can see is the blood of the endometrial shed. So it's a cycle. So you're going to reach the same point each time you complete the cycle. So if you pick any point to start from, it won't make any difference. So why do we pick the beginning of the menstrual phase to start from? Because this is actually when I will have the first visual sign. All right, which is the shedding of the endometrium. resulting in the blood flow. Questions? So looking at another highly important diagram here, another 5 stars diagram is showing the cut section of the ovary. Looking here, the primary follicles becoming secondary, becoming tertiary follicles, then Graafian follicle or mature follicle. Remember, in response to the sudden rise in the LH levels, the Graafian follicle gonna rupture, releasing the egg. Remember, what kind of egg do I have in all those growing follicles? What is the type of egg in here? It's a primary oocyte. How about the ones that got ovulated, that got released outside of the Graafian follicle? It's gonna be a secondary oocyte. You see on here around the ovulated egg, you're still gonna have some of the follicular cells attached to the egg. We call this cluster of cells around the ovulated egg, it's the corona radiata. It's like a radiating crown. What happens to the remaining part of the Graafian follicle? See, it starts to form the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum, again, for how long will it survive within the ovary? Corpus luteum will remain secreting progesterone for 14 days and will then degenerate. All right, so what do I expect you to write down on the essay question? Everything that we've mentioned today. So the essay question, it's a big essay question. It's gonna be out of 15 points. You need to describe in details oogenesis, follicular genesis, the hormonal changes, and the endometrium cycle or the uterine cycle. All those topics are going to be on here in detail. So follicular genesis, the stages of the development of the follicles. You start primordial, primary, secondary, and Graafian follicle. Graafian follicle ruptures, ovulation takes place, and the remaining part of the Graafian follicle becomes corpus luteum. This is my follicular genesis, the maturation of the follicle. Very important also. Remember, where is a normal site for fertilization? Many of you think in the endometrial cavity here. Many of you think that the fertilization, the sperm gonna meet the egg inside the endometrial cavity, but actually not. It's gonna be taking place in this bulging part of the uterine tube. If you remember, what do we call this bulging part of the uterine tube? It's the ampulla. So normal site for fertilization, it's gonna be the ampulla of the uterine tube. Also, a very important thing that you need to cover, it's the oogenesis. So you need to describe the different cells and what kind of division would they be performing. Remember, oogonia are going to be performing a mitotic division, and this takes place only during fetal life. Primary oocytes are going to be kept in the primordial follicles, and those primary oocytes are going to be arrested in prophase 1. They are not able to complete meiosis 1, the first step of meiosis. After puberty, oocytes are going to become activated. One selected oocyte is the one that resumes the meiosis 1, which is going to be located in the dominant follicle. Secondary oocytes will arrest in metaphase 2 after ovulation. Remember, secondary oocyte will not become a mature egg unless it gets penetrated by a sperm. So if penetrated by a sperm, the secondary oocyte completes meiosis 2 and will become an ovum. Remember, during the first step of meiosis, you formed the first polar body, and during the second phase of the meiosis, you formed the second polar body. What happens to the egg if there was no fertilization this month? It passes through atresia and degenerates. This is a repetition of what we previously discussed. Very important also part that you need to make sure that you state as part of your answer to the essay question, it's the hormonal interactions. Remember, always start by GnRH. This is the beginning. GnRH stimulates the pituitary gland, remember, to release FSH, LH. But mainly here we're focusing on FSH. FSH going to be stimulating the primordial follicles to develop into primary, secondary, and the dominant follicle will become the mature follicle. Remember, the mature follicle going to be releasing large amounts of estrogen. And this large estrogen output is going to have a positive feedback on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland, resulting in the release of large amounts of LH, because this is the LH surge. Remember, what are the three things that would be resulting from the LH surge? Three effects. First one, it's the completion of meiosis 1. So now the primary oocyte becomes a secondary oocyte. Second factor is that it triggers ovulation. Third effect on here is going to be the transformation of the remaining follicular cells into corpus luteum. Remember, corpus luteum degenerates within 14 days, causing a major drop in the progesterone levels for a new cycle to begin. If pregnancy takes place, the corpus luteum going to be producing its hormones until the placenta takes over at about 3 months. Questions? All right, so we can have a break for 10. We come back, discuss some homeostatic imbalances that are related to the reproductive system.